We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. The people of Israel are complaining that even though they fast and sacrifice, and obey all the rules of pleasing God, their condition does not improve. Many of them thought that if they conformed to certain outward rites and ceremonies, they were doing what the Lord required. The response of the Lord, again through the prophet Isaiah, is basically that they are hypocrites. They are religiously observant, but only in hopes of selfish and material gain. It's not what we do that matters, but why we're doing it. Selfish actions, even fasts, and sacrifices made for negative, selfish reasons, simply create negative selfish lives. There is no spiritual good, because there was no spiritual good in the initial intention. If we want our lives to express love and abundance, we must make that intention our purpose. Loose the bonds of injustice, share your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into your house. Jesus later reiterates all these imperatives, and they are as urgent today as then. In essence, God addressed the sins He is charging them with, which made their fasts unacceptable to Him. Our lesson begins with verse 6, where God poses a question to His people and also answers it. He said, "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke?" God explained that the true fasting He wants should reflect what is in the minds and hearts, to deny the body appetites and focus instead on God. And that can be a useful practice that draws one closer to God. First, the Lord said that a true fast, or the fast that He have chosen, is to loosen the chains of injustice. This means to set free anyone who has, through wickedness, been placed in chains or illegally held slaves. The law stated that Hebrew slaves were to be released after 6 years of service, but this law was often violated. Second, God said that a true fast day was to untie the cords of the yoke. A yoke joined two animals together at the neck, particularly oxen, while they were being worked, implying workers need to be unburdened. Third, God said that a true fast was to let the oppressed go free. Abusive treatment that Jewish masters were meting out, especially on fast days, must be stopped. Fourth, God said that a true fast meant that you break every yoke. This was a call for the people to wipe out every instance of oppression. Instead of selfishly continuing to force labor from the helpless, the truly repentant worshiper gives them freedom and rest. Oppression can only be ended when people's hearts are honoring God. Verse 7 says, "Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood?" In this passage, Isaiah shares a different kind of fasting. One we could all easily practice. It involves self-denial. But rather than for meditative purposes, it is so that I can give. The fasting Isaiah is talking about is taking what you would ordinarily spend on yourself, and giving it to those who are in need. To use my fasting to feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, and clothe the naked. For example, rather than going out to eat, buy a gift card from a restaurant and give it to a homeless person. According to Isaiah, that is the kind of fasting God has chosen. Even if we are not involved directly, we can participate by giving money, or by sponsoring an orphan through one of the many fine programs and organizations that exist. The true worshiper provides the material needs of life to others, and does not attempt to turn away from those who are lacking, including family members. We are not to hide from people when they need help. Verse 8 says, "Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear, then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard." After the questions the Lord asked concerning the nature of true fasting or worship, he gives a series of promises to the worshipper. God promised salvation and national prosperity, after the people repented and began living according to God's instructions. First, the people who had been in darkness because of their hypocritical and insincere worship, would be surrounded by light, and God is light. As the light of dawn suddenly replaces the darkness of night, people would see a sudden change in their own lives. Second, the Lord said, the healing of a wound, or in a figurative sense, a restoration will occur. Things and conditions that had been diseased due to disobedience, would be restored to full health. But again, the emphasis is on the speed with which the restoration happens. When God's people honestly face their spiritual sickness and bring out fruits of repentance, their restoration will happen rapidly. Obedience would result in more than the material well-being of the people. Third, the Lord promised, and your righteousness will go before you, the glory of the Lord shall be rear guard. The words your righteousness, refers to God himself. The prophet Jeremiah stated that he shall be called, the Lord, our righteousness, Jeremiah 23:6. The Lord would go before the people in all his holiness to prepare their way if they would allow him to do so. The Lord's glory would be the rear guard of the people. The idea here is that God's people are likened to an army on the march, led by the righteousness of the Lord. By being obedient to the Lord, the people would be surrounded by him. This imagery brings to mind the pillar of a cloud by day and the pillar of fire at night, by which the Lord guided his people in the desert. Verse 9 says, then you will call, and the Lord will answer, you will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk. Finally, God promised that what the people want most, communication with him, would be established. God said you will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. This is a promise of answered prayer. Nothing is more frustrating in the life of someone who knows God than to feel like he is not responding to their cries for help. Purely external worship will not bring a favorable response from God, but those who conform to his will, are assured of his answer. Not until we respond to God's call, will he listen to ours. In the midst of these rewards for sincere worship, including fasting, the Lord reminded the Israelites again what he expected from them. First, God called on his people to abandon this practice of oppressing and overburdening others. They were to also stop pointing one's finger, an expression of scorn toward people, especially the godly man of humble faith. The Israelites were also to stop wicked, malicious, or false talk. All of these practices and underlying attitudes had to be laid aside, if God's people were to enjoy answers to their prayers. The same thing holds true for believers today. Our final verse says, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. Instead of continuing the sinful behaviors and attitudes mentioned in the previous verses, God said that the people needed to give of themselves completely, including one's means, so that all a person's needs will be satisfied. Returning to reiterate the reward for sincere fasting and worship, the Lord again promised, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. Of course, this refers to the light of God's presence and the blessings that result from it. Remarkably, God said that their light, who is God, would burst out suddenly out of the midst of obscurity and your darkness once the Israelites repented of their sins, and gave him the worship he deserves from sincere hearts. God promises light. Fasting is a form of worship, and our lesson teaches that feeding the hungry, housing the poor, stopping oppression of the poor, and clothing the naked are acts of fasting or worship that God accepts. Fasting, then, is not just giving up the necessities of life for a moment, it is giving them up to help others. If we honor others in our daily treatment through acts of love and self-sacrifice, God will honor us by accepting our worship. God promises light. 1. Fasting is a legitimate form of worship for the Christian, but the result of the fast should be a greater desire for service toward others, Isaiah 58:6. Biblical fasting is a practice of humbling yourself before God, which makes you mentally, spiritually, and physically refreshed to serve the Lord and your fellow men. 2. Spiritual service should result in sharing material blessings with the less fortunate, Isaiah 58:7. As we share what we have with others, our own problems seem less serious, besides becoming less selfish, ourselves. 3. A person who seeks the righteousness of God cannot help but be followed by the glory of God, Isaiah 58:8. Righteousness is the basis for justification, and the glory of God will promote you and even make your greatest enemy to bow down before you. 4. A key to having prayers answered is to have a genuine concern for God's righteousness and the well-being of those around us, Isaiah 58:9. Praying for others can help reduce social isolation and enhance well-being. Such environment give people and communities the opportunity to thrive and prosper. 5. A person prominent in the work of God is one who has dedicated himself or herself to the service of their fellow man, Isaiah 58:10. God created us in order to give us dignity and purpose, by allowing us to share in His work, which includes serving others. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.